Rain had been falling over the valley for 3 days, and Elena Ashworth had come to think of it as the sky's own way of grieving, since she herself had run dry of tears somewhere around the 2nd week. She sat now in the office of Harmon Pruitt, the family's attorney for 2 generations, in a leather chair too large for her, wearing the same black dress she had worn to the funeral because it was the only formal thing left that still fit properly over the weight she'd lost since June. Julian had been dead 11 weeks. The vines outside, his vines, his father's vines, the vines that had been in the Ashworth family since 1961, did not know that. They kept growing the way vines do, indifferent and green, needing pruning and water and sun in a way that made Elena feel, some mornings, like the last sane person on earth, tending to something that refused to acknowledge the wreckage around it. "There's a codicil," Harmon said, not looking up from the folder in front of him. He was a heavy man who had known Julian since Julian was in diapers, and grief sat on him too, folded into the lines around his eyes. "Added 4 years ago. Julian didn't want you to see it until now." "A codicil to what?" "To the trust that owns the vineyard." Harmon finally lifted his eyes to hers. "Elena, I want you to understand that I argued against this clause when Julian brought it to me. I told him it was archaic and possibly unenforceable and cruel to ask of you. He didn't listen. He rarely did when his mind was made up." Elena felt something cold move through her chest, the particular dread of a person who has already lost everything being told there is more to lose. "Just tell me. The vineyard, the winery, the label, the distribution contracts, all of it is held in the Ashworth family trust. Your father-in-law set it up that way before he died, to keep the business out of probate and out of any single heir's hands. The trust has 2 named beneficiaries who must act jointly to inherit full control. Julian was one. And I'm his widow. I inherit his half." "You inherit his interest," Harmon said carefully. "But the trust requires that both named beneficiaries be, in the language of the document, bound in marriage to a lineal or collateral descendant of Warren Ashworth, in order for either to exercise full authority over the trust's assets. It's an old clause. Warren wrote it in 1988, after his own divorce nearly split the winery in half during the settlement. He wanted to make sure the land could never be carved up by a marriage that ended, or a marriage that didn't exist at all. He wanted every controlling interest married into the family, permanently, formally, before the trust would release full operating control." Elena's mouth had gone dry. "I don't understand what that has to do with me. I am married into the family." "You were," Harmon said gently. "Julian's death dissolved the marriage, legally speaking, for purposes of this trust. The codicil, the part Julian added 4 years ago, names the second beneficiary. It's not a cousin or a business partner, the way I assumed it might be when Julian first mentioned it. It's his brother." "Julian didn't have a brother." "Half-brother," Harmon said. "On his father's side. Warren had an affair in 1979. During a buying trip to Seoul, Warren was importing oak for the barrels, if I remember the story right, and he met a woman named Han Soo-jin. There was a child. Warren paid for the boy's upbringing quietly for years, through a lawyer in Los Angeles, but he never acknowledged him publicly, never brought him into the business, never even met him, as far as I know. Julian found out about him 6 years ago, going through Warren's papers after the old man died. He tracked him down. They wrote letters. They apparently met once in San Francisco, about 2 years before Julian got sick." Elena sat very still. Outside the window the rain kept coming down, gray and patient, on the hills that held 1,100 acres of Cabernet and Syrah and the small, stubborn block of Pinot Noir that Julian had planted himself the year they got married, in soil everyone told him was wrong for it. It had turned out, against all advice, to be extraordinary. "His name is Daniel," Harmon went on. "Daniel Kong. He took his mother's married name. She remarried when he was young, a man named Kong who adopted him. He grew up in Seoul and then in Los Angeles. He's 38. He works in finance, or did. I understand he left that a few years ago. Julian named him as the trust's second beneficiary the year they met, alongside you because Julian believed, and I'm reading his own words to you now, Elena, from his letter to me, that the vineyard should belong to both halves of my father's life, not just the half he was proud of." "So what does that mean for me?" Elena said. and her voice came out flatter and harder than she intended. Practically, today. Harmon set down the folder. Practically, it means that as of Julian's death, you and Daniel Kong are joint beneficiaries of the trust, each holding a partial, restricted interest. Neither of you can sell, mortgage, replant, rebrand, or make any capital decision above $50,000 without the other's signature. And neither of you gains full authority, the kind that would let either of you say buy the other out or make unilateral decisions about the winery's future, unless the trust's marriage clause is satisfied. Which means, as written, unless the two named beneficiaries are married to each other, or unless both marry outside descendants of Warren approved by the trust protector, which is, he checked the folder. Myself, and I can tell you now, I would consider approving almost nothing, because Warren wrote this thing to be nearly impossible to satisfy any other way. He wanted the winery to stay unified. He built a legal knot, Elena, and I don't think even he fully understood how tight he'd tied it. You're telling me, Elena said slowly, that the only way I keep any real say over what happens to this place, the only way I'm not just a woman with a frozen, useless quarter share of a business I've given 11 years of my life to, is to marry a stranger. I'm telling you that's what the document says. I'm not telling you it's the only path forward. There are other options. You could petition to break the trust, which would take years and legal fees that would eat most of what you'd win, and could still fail because Warren built it to survive exactly that kind of challenge. You could sell your restricted interest to Daniel outright, for whatever he'd offer, and walk away with money but no vineyard. You could let the two of you simply hold your restricted shares forever, deadlocked, neither of you able to do much of anything, while the winery slowly stagnates for lack of investment. Or, he spread his hands, you satisfy the clause. He's a stranger, Elena said again, because it seemed like the only thing in the room that was simply, unambiguously true. I don't even know what he looks like. I found out he existed 4 minutes ago. I know. Does he know? About the clause. His attorney called mine yesterday, Harmon said. He knows. Elena drove home along Silverado Trail with the windshield wipers going and her hands too tight on the wheel, past the gate with the wrought iron A that Warren had installed decades ago, past the long gravel drive lined with valley oaks that Julian used to say were older than the winery, older than the county, maybe older than the idea of Napa as a wine region at all. The house came into view, not the big Craftsman where Julian had grown up, which now stood empty and shuttered, waiting for some decision no one had the strength to make, but the smaller stone cottage at the edge of the property where she and Julian had lived since their wedding, close enough to the crush pad that in October you could smell the fermenting must through the windows even with them shut. She sat in the driveway for a long time before she went in. The thing Harmon hadn't said, the thing she turned over and over as the rain drummed on the roof of the car, was that she didn't actually want to walk away. That was the part that frightened her most. She had built her whole adult self around this place. She'd come to it at 26, a sommelier with a decent resume and no family money, and Julian had fallen for her over a blind tasting of 6 different cabernets she'd correctly ranked by vintage. And in the 11 years since she had learned this land the way you learn a person, slowly, through failure and small triumphs, through the particular stubbornness of the clay soil on the east block and the way frost settled differently in the low corner near the creek. She had grown, over a decade, from Julian's wife into something the old Vineyard hands actually respected. Not because of who she'd married, but because she'd earned it, hour by hour, harvest by harvest. To lose that now, on top of losing Julian, felt like a second amputation. But to marry a man she had never met, a man who was what exactly to her? A stranger who happened to share half of Julian's blood, half of his father's difficult legacy, and none, presumably, of the 11 years of shared history that had made Julian Julian to her. That felt like something closer to violence. A transaction dressed up as a marriage. Warren Ashworth reaching up out of his grave, 20 years after his own death, to arrange one more marriage of convenience for the sake of his precious unified acreage. She went inside. She poured a glass of the 19 Pinot, Julian's Pinot, the one everyone had told him wouldn't work, and she sat at the kitchen table with it untouched in front of her and she cried for the first time in 11 days. Not for Julian this time, oddly, but for herself, for the strange narrow corridor her life had suddenly become. Daniel Kong received the same phone call from his own attorney on a Tuesday afternoon in his apartment in downtown Los Angeles, a place with floor-to-ceiling windows and almost no furniture, because he had moved in 6 months ago and never gotten around to making it look like anyone actually lived there. He had left finance 2 years earlier, a slow-motion departure that had started with burnout and ended with something closer to disgust at the industry, at himself. At 14 years spent optimizing other people's money while his own life went strangely, quietly hollow, and he had spent the time since doing consulting work he didn't care about and trying, without much success, to figure out what came next. His mother, Sujin, had died the year before. That had been its own grief, complicated by the fact that she had never told him the whole truth about his father until she was already sick. Not the affair, which he'd always half known about in the vague way children know things adults won't say out loud, but the specifics. The name Warren Ashworth, the winery in Napa, the half-brother 2 years younger than Daniel who had grown up in the house Daniel's father actually lived in, with the last name Daniel might have had, if things had gone differently. He had written to Julian on impulse, after his mother's funeral, half expecting no answer at all. Instead, Julian had written back within a week, warm, curious, apologetic in a way that surprised Daniel, given that none of it was Julian's fault. They'd met once, in San Francisco, for what was supposed to be coffee and turned into an 8-hour day that ended at a bar near the Ferry Building. Both of them a little drunk and laughing about their father's terrible taste in ties, both of them circling, without quite saying it, the strange grief of having had a father who was, in different ways, absent from both their lives, present but withholding for Julian, entirely unacknowledged for Daniel. Julian had told him that day that he wanted to make things right, that he was adding Daniel to the trust. Daniel had assumed, in the vague way you assume things about paperwork you don't fully understand, that this meant some kind of eventual minor inheritance, money maybe, or a token gesture. He had not read the trust document itself. He had not known about the marriage clause until his attorney explained it to him yesterday, in a tone that suggested she found the whole thing almost entertaining, an anachronism dug up out of some 1980s divorce paranoia. "So let me understand this," Daniel had said, standing at his window looking down at the traffic on Figueroa. "The only way I get any real control over an inheritance I never asked for, from a father I never met, is to marry my dead half-brother's widow, a woman I've never spoken to in my life. That's the plain reading, yes," his attorney had said, "unless you want to walk away from it. Which, frankly, might be the sane choice. You don't need the money." He didn't, that was true. He had done well enough in finance that he didn't need Warren Ashworth's guilt money, didn't need a controlling interest in a business he'd never worked a day of his life in. And yet something in him, something that had been sitting dormant and unnamed since his mother's death, since the sudden collapse of the life he'd built in finance, since the long gray months of not knowing what he was for, caught on the idea the way a hand catches on a nail. Julian had wanted this. Julian, who owed him nothing, who could have kept the whole inheritance for himself and never told Daniel any of it existed, had instead gone out of his way to write him into his father's legacy. It felt, absurdly, like the first time in Daniel's life that anyone connected to Warren Ashworth had chosen him on purpose. He flew to San Francisco 3 days later, rented a car, and drove north into the valley without calling ahead. Elena was in the crush pad office going over harvest schedules with Ruiz, the vineyard manager, a compact and unshakable man who had worked the land under 3 generations of Ashworths and referred to the vines the way other people referred to livestock they'd raised from birth. When Consuela from the tasting room called through on the radio to say there was a man at the gate asking for her by name, and that he'd given his name as Daniel Kong, Elena's stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. "Send him up," she said, and then immediately regretted it, because she was wearing work boots caked in mud and a flannel shirt of Julian's that she had taken to wearing without quite admitting to herself why, and her hair was pulled back in a knot that had come half undone hours ago, and none of that was how she had imagined meeting this man, if she had let herself imagine it at all. Ruiz looked at her with the careful neutrality of a man who had clearly heard the rumors already. The valley was small, gossip moved through it faster than frost, and said only, "You want me to stay?" "No," Elena said. "Thank you, Ruiz. I'll find you after." She walked out to the gravel turnaround in front of the crush pad, and she watched a gray rental sedan come up the drive slower than the road required, the way a person drives when they're not sure they're allowed to be somewhere, and she watched it stop, and she watched the door open, and a man got out who was, she registered with a strange, guilty jolt, nothing like what she had pictured. He was tall, taller than Julian had been, with black hair cut close at the sides and left longer on top, the kind of haircut that looked deliberate without looking vain. He wore a dark gray sweater and jeans. No jacket despite the chill that had settled into the valley after the rain. And he moved toward her with the particular hesitance of someone crossing into a room where he isn't sure of his welcome. His face, when he got close enough for her to really see it, had Julian's jaw in it. She saw that immediately, and it hit her harder than she expected, a small violent echo of grief. But the eyes were entirely different, dark and watchful in a way Julian's had never been, Julian who had worn his every feeling on the surface of his face his whole life. "Elena," he said. Not a question exactly, though it had the shape of one. His voice was low, careful. "I'm Daniel. I should have called first. I'm sorry. I got in the car this morning and I just kept driving and I didn't let myself think about it too hard, or I don't think I would have come at all. It's—" Elena started, and found she didn't actually know how to finish the sentence. "Fine" seemed absurd. "Good that you're here" seemed like a lie, or at least premature. "You look like him," she said instead, which was the truest thing available to her, and immediately wished she hadn't, because something moved across Daniel's face. A flinch quickly controlled, that told her this was not new information to him and not comfortable information either. "So I've been told," he said. "Never by anyone who mattered until now." They stood there a moment, the wind moving through the vine rows behind him, dropping the temperature another few degrees, and Elena became aware that she was staring, cataloging him against the ghost of his brother the way you can't help doing with siblings, looking for the places where the resemblance held and the places where it broke. "You want to see the place," she said. It wasn't quite a question either. "Since you're here, if you don't mind." "I don't know if I mind or not," Elena said honestly. "I found out about the will 4 days ago. I found out about you 4 days ago. I've had about 11 days total to figure out how to be a widow, and now I'm supposed to also figure out how to be—" She stopped herself because she hadn't meant to say it out loud, the shape of the thing sitting between them, unaddressed. "How to be my business partner in an arrangement neither of us designed," Daniel finished for her, gently, giving her the more comfortable version of the sentence she hadn't been able to complete. "I know. I read the trust document on the flight up. I've been sitting with it for 6 hours and I still don't fully believe it's real. I'm sorry that this landed on you on top of everything else. That's not— I didn't come here to make anything harder." Something in the quality of his apology loosened a knot in Elena's chest that she hadn't realized was there. She had braced, without knowing she was bracing, for arrogance or opportunism, or some slick finance guy version of a man who'd smelled money and come to collect it. What she got instead was a person standing awkwardly on gravel in the cold, hands jammed in his pockets, visibly uncertain of his own right to be there. "Come on," she said. "I'll show you around. It's your family's land too, apparently. Might as well see what you almost inherited a stake in." She walked him through the crush pad first. Empty now, waiting for harvest, the stainless tanks gleaming dully in the gray afternoon light, and then out along the edge of the east block, where the Cabernet vines stood in disciplined rows going gold and rust at the edges of their leaves, the first sign of the year's turn toward autumn. Daniel asked questions as they walked, and they were, Elena noted with some surprise, good questions. Not the polite, empty questions of someone making conversation, but real ones, about soil composition and rootstock and why the rows ran the direction they did. And when she answered him, she found herself falling into the rhythm of explaining the vineyard the way she used to explain it to visitors in the early years, before it became so completely her own language that she forgot not everyone spoke it. "Julian used to talk about a Pinot block," Daniel said, as they came around the bend near the creek, and stopped in front of the small stubborn plot of vines that stood apart from the rest, planted in tighter rows, on a slope everyone had told Julian was wrong for the varietal. "Is this it?" Elena felt her throat tighten. "He planted these himself. The year we got married. Everyone said the soil was too rich, too much clay, that Pinot needed something leaner. He didn't listen. He never listened to anyone about anything he actually cared about." She reached out and touched one of the canes, an old habit, a way of checking in with the vine the way you check in with a person. It turned out to be some of the best fruit on the property. "We've been getting 90+ scores on the Pinot for the last 4 vintages. He used to say." Her voice caught, and she pushed through it, because she'd found that stopping mid-sentence was worse than finishing. "He used to say that the wine business was full of people who did what the soil report told them, and not enough people who actually talked to the land. Daniel was quiet for a moment. He wrote me about this block. In one of his letters, he said he'd planted something stubborn and unlikely the year he got married, and that it had proven everyone wrong, and that he thought. Daniel hesitated, and Elena saw him decide visibly to say the rest of it anyway. He said he thought that was the whole secret of a good marriage. Planting something unlikely and refusing to let anyone talk you out of it. Elena had to look away, out over the vines and down toward the creek, blinking hard against the sudden wet heat behind her eyes. He wrote that to you? To a brother he'd met once. We wrote a lot, actually. More than once. I think. Daniel's voice went rougher, and she glanced back at him to find his jaw tight, his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder. I think he was lonely for family in a way he didn't let himself admit. Warren was not a warm man, from what I understand. Julian said he spent most of his childhood trying to earn something from him that never quite arrived. I think finding out he had a brother, someone who understood exactly what that kind of father does to a person, without him having to explain it. I think that mattered to him more than he let on, even to me. We only met once in person. San Francisco. 8 hours that felt like. He stopped, shook his head slightly. I keep thinking I'll get to see him again. I keep forgetting, and then remembering. I do that too, Elena said quietly. I'll think of something to tell him. Some stupid thing. A barn owl got into the equipment shed last week. He would have found that hilarious. He had this whole theory about the owl being the ghost of his grandfather checking up on things. And I'll actually pick up my phone before I remember. They stood there together at the edge of the Pinot block, two strangers bound by the specific narrow grief of loving the same dead man in entirely different registers. One a decade of daily intimacy, the other a handful of letters and a single long afternoon, and something passed between them that was not yet anything like attraction, was not yet anything Elena could name, but was recognition, at least. The unbearable loneliness of missing someone that almost no one else missed in quite the same way. Meeting, for a moment, its mirror. I should tell you, Daniel said finally, that I don't want to make this harder than it already is. Whatever we decide, about the trust, about all of it, I don't want you to feel like I came here to pressure you into anything. I have enough money. I don't need this vineyard. If you want to fight the clause, or sell me your interest, or let it sit deadlocked forever, I'll live with whatever you decide. I only came because I wanted to see it. The place he loved enough to write to a stranger about grape stubbornness as a marriage philosophy. I wanted to see if I could understand him a little better, now that it's too late to ask him anything else. Elena looked at him for a long moment, really looked, past the ghost of Julian in his jaw, past the strangeness of the whole situation, and saw someone standing at the edge of his own grief with the same raw, unpracticed hands she recognized from her own mirror. Stay for dinner, she heard herself say. Not because of the trust. Because you drove 4 hours to look at some dirt your brother loved, and it's cold, and I have half a pot of something on the stove, and I don't actually want to eat alone tonight. Daniel's mouth did something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. I'd like that, he said. Thank you. The stone cottage held its warmth against the evening chill the way old buildings do, unevenly, with cold spots by the windows and a stubborn, generous heat radiating from the wood stove Elena had lit before Daniel arrived, before she'd known he would still be there for dinner, before she'd known anything about how the evening would go. She served him the stew she'd made 2 days ago and been eating alone from ever since, and a bottle of the Ashworth Cabernet, not because she wanted to perform hospitality with the family label, but because it was what was always open, in a house that made its living from wine. Daniel ate like a man who hadn't eaten a real meal in some time, and Elena recognized that too. The particular hollow-cheeked hunger of the recently and unpredictably grieving, the way appetite comes back only in strange fits and starts. Tell me about him, Daniel said, when the first edge of hunger had worn off. Julian, not the version in his letters. The actual version. The one you married. Elena turned her wine glass slowly by the stem, watching the firelight move through it. He was loud, she said finally. Loud in a good way. He filled a room. He had opinions about everything from soil pH to the correct way to grill a steak, and he was almost always at least a little bit right, which made him insufferable and also very hard not to love. He proposed to me in the crush pad during his first harvest with me, completely covered in must, on one knee in front of the whole crew, and I said yes before I even thought about it because it seemed like exactly the kind of ridiculous, unplanned thing his whole life was made of. She smiled, and it hurt, but it was a good kind of hurt, the kind that meant something was still alive in her. He was afraid of almost nothing except failing this place. He used to say his father built a business and he wanted to build a legacy, and he never quite explained to me what the difference was, but I think I understood it anyway. He wanted this land to mean something beyond money. He wanted— She stopped, feeling the grief rise thick in her throat again, and pushed through it the way she'd learned to, in the last 11 weeks, because stopping only made it worse. He wanted people to still be drinking his Pinot in 50 years and arguing about whether he'd been a genius or just lucky. He was diagnosed how long before? 14 months, Elena said. Pancreatic. It moves fast when it moves. We had— Her voice caught properly this time, and she let it, because Daniel wasn't looking at her with pity, only with the quiet, unflinching attention of someone who understood that this kind of pain doesn't want to be managed, only witnessed. We had a good 14 months, actually. Once the shock wore off, we stopped fighting about small things. We finished the reserve blend together, the one that's aging in barrel right now, the last wine he'll ever have a hand in making, and some nights that felt like the most important thing either of us had ever done. More important than any of the years before it, because we knew exactly how limited the time was and we didn't waste any of it pretending otherwise. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, turning his own glass, and when he spoke his voice had gone rougher. My mother was sick for 6 years before she died. Slow, not fast. Some awful patient cancer that kept coming back smaller and then bigger again and again until it finally won. I spent those 6 years mostly angry. At the disease, at doctors, at myself for not being able to fix it, and I think I wasted some of that time being angry when I should have just been there. I envy you that. The 14 months you actually used. I'm sorry about your mother. She was the only parent who ever actually raised me, Daniel said. My stepfather adopted me when I was 6, gave me his name, and he was decent enough, but he wasn't the reason I got up every morning. She was funny and stubborn, and she never once complained about Warren Ashworth to my face, not once in 38 years, even though I know now what it cost her, being the woman in the story nobody wanted to talk about. I found out the whole truth of it only after she died, going through her things, finding letters from an attorney I didn't recognize, checks that had come quietly for years and then stopped. She protected me from all of it. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive Warren for making that necessary. He wasn't kind to Julian either, Elena said. Not in the ways that count. He gave him this. She gestured vaguely at the walls of the cottage, the dark shape of the vineyard beyond the windows. But he never once told him he was proud of him. Not that Julian ever repeated to me, and Julian spent most of his life quietly trying to earn something that was never coming. I think that's part of why he reached out to you. I think some part of him understood, better than most people could, exactly what it costs to be raised by a man who measures love in acreage. The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moving through the vine rows with a sound like slow breathing. I keep waiting to feel resentful of him, Daniel admitted. Warren, I think I'm supposed to feel resentful, and some days I do, but mostly what I feel is just absence. A shape where a father should have been, and no real grief for the man himself because I never had him long enough to grieve. It's a strange kind of loss. Grieving something you never actually had. Elena looked at him across the small table, in the low gold light of the stove, and felt the peculiar vertigo of recognizing herself in a stranger's grief. Not the same shape as her own, but adjacent to it, close enough to understand from the inside. I think that might be the loneliest kind, she said. At least I got 11 years. At least I have 1,000 specific things to miss. You're grieving a whole life that was never even offered to you. Julian offered me a piece of it, Daniel said, for 2 years before he died. Letters, mostly, and one long day in San Francisco that I've thought about more than almost anything else in my life since. I keep wondering what it would have been like if we'd had more time, if we'd gotten to actually know each other instead of just corresponding, trying to catch up on 36 years in a handful of letters and one bar tab. You could still get to know him, Elena said, surprising herself with the offer before she'd fully thought it through. Obviously not him, but this place. The wine he made. I could show you, if you wanted. Not because of the trust. Just because it seems like a waste, that you drove all this way and I've told you about him and now you're just gonna get back in a rental car and disappear to Los Angeles. And the only brother he ever had will have spent one evening on the land he loved and never see it again. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Something careful and unguarded moving across his face at once. I'd like that, he said. If you're sure it's not too much. I don't want to be a complication in a grief that's already complicated enough. You're already a complication, Elena said, and it came out gentler than she expected, almost fond. Might as well be a complication I actually understand a little, instead of a stranger my lawyer keeps calling to talk about. He stayed 3 more days in the valley in a bed and breakfast off the Silverado Trail, and each of those days Elena found reasons to bring him back to the property. Not out of any decision made, not yet, but out of something that felt more like gravity than choice. She walked him through the barrel room and let him taste the reserve blend straight from barrel, the one Julian had finished, and watched Daniel's face do something complicated and moved when she told him this was the last wine his brother's hands had ever touched. She took him up to the ridge above the property, where you could see the whole valley spread out gold and green in the afternoon light, and told him about the barn owl and the equipment shed and 100 small, ordinary stories about a man Daniel had barely gotten to know, offering them to him the way you'd offer someone food when you didn't have money to give but had this instead, an abundance of memory that cost her something with every sentence and that she found herself wanting to give away anyway, because Daniel received each story like it mattered, like he was hungry for exactly this and had not known, until she started talking, how hungry he'd been. On the 3rd evening, standing again at the edge of the Pinot Block as the sun went down gold and orange behind the western hills, Daniel said without preamble, I have to fly back tomorrow. I have not much actually waiting for me, an apartment with no furniture and a consulting contract I don't particularly want to renew. But I have to go back and figure out what I'm doing with my life because right now the honest answer is nothing, and that's not sustainable whatever we decide about the trust. What do you want to do? Elena asked. If you could do anything. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the vines going dark gold in the last light. I think, he said slowly, like he was discovering the answer as he spoke it, I think I might want to learn this. Not take it from you, I meant what I said. I don't need the money, I don't need to own half of anything. But learn it. The way you talk about the soil, the way you know exactly why this block does what it does when the soil report says it shouldn't. I spent 14 years optimizing numbers on a screen for people who never once asked me what I actually cared about, and I think I might care about this. About land that remembers things. About a brother who planted something unlikely and made everyone wrong about it. I don't know what that means practically. I don't know if it means anything you'd want. But I wanted to say it out loud before I got on a plane and lost my nerve. Elena stood beside him in the fading light, the cold coming up now off the creek, and felt something shift in her chest that she was not yet ready to name. Not love, not yet, nothing so simple or so fast, only the quiet, dangerous recognition that this man standing beside her, this stranger who had driven 4 hours on impulse to look at dirt his dead brother loved, might turn out to be someone she wanted to know for a very long time. Come back, she said, after you sort out your life in LA. Come back and I'll teach you what I know. We don't have to decide anything about the trust yet. We don't have to decide anything about. She gestured vaguely between them, unable to finish the sentence, and saw Daniel's mouth curve, just slightly, in understanding. We just have to figure out how to be 2 people who both loved the same man, standing on the same land, trying to build something out of what's left. That's enough for now. That's more than enough. Okay, Daniel said, and the word carried more weight than its size. Okay, I'll come back. The rest of this novel would continue across many more chapters. Daniel's return to the valley, the slow unlearning of grief into partnership, the harvest season that forces them into daily proximity, the family and community pressures around the marriage clause, moments of real friction, his outsider status, her fierce protectiveness of Julian's legacy, the ethical strangeness of the arrangement itself, and the gradual, hard-won turn from grief companionship into something neither of them expected to feel again. Los Angeles did not feel the way it used to feel to Daniel when he came back to it that Thursday night, tired from the drive to San Francisco and the flight and the crawl of traffic from LAX to downtown. His apartment looked, as it always did lately, like a hotel room someone had forgotten to check out of. The floor-to-ceiling windows showing the same indifferent grid of city lights, the same near-empty kitchen, the same absence of anything that suggested a person actually lived inside these walls and not just passed through them between flights and meetings that no longer meant anything to him. He stood at the window for a long time that first night back. A glass of the Ashworth Cabernet Elena had sent him home with sitting untouched on the counter, and he found himself doing the thing he'd sworn on the drive to the airport he wouldn't do, which was replaying the whole 4 days in the valley, turning them over like a man checking a wound to see if it still hurt. Still hurt. Differently than before, though. Before, the ache had been the specific, nameless grief of losing a brother he'd barely gotten to have. Now there was something else woven into it, something he didn't yet have language for and wasn't sure he was allowed to name even to himself. A woman standing at the edge of a Pinot block in the gold hour before sunset, telling him about a barn owl with more tenderness than most people managed for their own families, offering him her grief like it was something valuable enough to share with a stranger, because apparently, somewhere in those 4 days, he had stopped being quite so much of a stranger. He called his attorney the next morning. "I want to keep the trust interest," he said. "I'm not selling. I'm not walking away." "Okay," she said, in a tone that suggested she'd expected this and had opinions about it she was choosing not to voice yet. "And the marriage clause?" "I don't know yet," Daniel said honestly. "But I'm not deciding anything from 400 miles away based on a legal document. If something happens, it happens because it's real. Not because a dead man wrote a clause in 1988. That's admirably principled," his attorney said. "And legally useless, but I respect it. What do you want me to tell the trust protector?" "Tell him we're figuring it out." Elena, for her part, spent the week after Daniel left in a strange, unsettled state that she didn't examine too closely, because examining it felt dangerous in a way she wasn't ready for. She threw herself into harvest preparation. The Cabernet block was 2 weeks out, the Pinot maybe 10 days, and there was equipment to service and a crew to finalize and 100 small decisions that Julian used to make with her, side by side. Decisions she now had to make alone in a way that still, 11 weeks in, occasionally stopped her cold in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. But underneath the harvest work, quieter, she kept catching herself thinking about Daniel. Not in any way she could name as romantic, not yet, but in the way you think about a person who has become, unexpectedly, essential to a story you're still living. She found herself wanting to tell him things. A hawk had taken up residence in the old oak by the crush pad, and Julian would have had 11 theories about what it meant. Ruiz had found a section of the cab block with early signs of botrytis, and they'd have to move the harvest schedule up. She caught herself twice drafting text messages to a number she'd only had for a week, and deleting them because it seemed too soon, too strange, too much like leaning on a man who had his own grief to carry without also carrying hers. He texted first on the Tuesday after he left. "How's the harvest prep going?" Ruiz sounds terrifying, in a good way. Elena smiled at her phone in a way that felt, for the first time in 11 weeks, uncomplicated. She wrote back about the botrytis and the hawk and Ruiz's genuinely terrifying efficiency, and by the end of the week they had fallen into an easy daily rhythm of messages that had nothing to do with the trust and everything to do with two people slowly, carefully, learning the shape of each other. Daniel came back to the valley on a Sunday morning, 3 weeks after his first visit, not because Elena had asked him to but because he'd asked her, tentatively, over a phone call that had run 2 hours longer than either of them expected, whether he could come help with harvest. Not as an owner, not as anything to do with the trust, just as a pair of hands if she'd have him. "You've never picked a grape in your life?" Elena said, laughing, the first real laugh he'd heard from her. "No," Daniel admitted. "But I'm told I'm a fast learner, and I have absolutely nothing else to do with my time that matters as much as this does." She put him on the Pinot block, the one Julian had planted, because it felt right. She couldn't have explained why, except that something in her wanted Daniel's first harvest to be in the vines that carried the most of his brother in them. She showed him how to read the clusters, how to cut without damaging the cane, how to move down the row at the particular unhurried pace that harvest demanded. A pace utterly unlike the frantic hours he'd spent his whole career moving at. By mid-morning his hands were cramping and his back ached in a way he hadn't expected, and he was, despite all of it, happier than he could remember being in years. There was something in the physical rhythm of the work. Cut, inspect, drop into the bin, move to the next cluster. That quieted the part of his mind that had spent 14 years running numbers in endless anxious loops. Around him the crew worked and joked in a mix of English and Spanish, and Ruiz kept a watchful, approving eye on how quickly Daniel picked up the rhythm, and somewhere around noon, sweating in the October sun with purple-stained hands, Daniel Kong understood, with sudden and total clarity, that this was the first time in longer than he could remember that he had felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Elena worked the row across from him, and every so often their eyes met over the vines, and neither of them said anything about it, but something was building between the silences. Not urgent, not rushed, but steady, the way good wine builds complexity over years in a barrel nobody's allowed to open too soon. At the end of the day, the crew gathered at long tables set up near the crush pad for the harvest dinner Elena hosted every year. A tradition Julian had started and that she'd kept, this year, through sheer stubborn refusal to let his death cancel one more thing he'd loved. Daniel sat beside her, sunburned and sore and grinning in a way that made him look, for the first time since she'd met him, entirely unguarded, and when Ruiz stood to give the traditional toast to the harvest, he added at the end, a line that made Elena's throat tighten. And to Julian's brother, who picked his first row of Pinot today, in Julian's own block. Julian would have said he was a slow picker but a good one. High praise, from that man. Daniel raised his glass, and Elena watched him blink hard, twice, before he managed to say, "Thank you, all of you, for letting me be part of this, even for a day." Later, after the tables had cleared and the crew had drifted home and the first stars had come out cold and bright over the valley, Elena and Daniel sat together on the low stone wall outside the crush pad, both of them too tired and too sunburned to move, and let a long, comfortable silence stretch between them. "I think I understand now," Daniel said finally. "What you meant, about the land remembering things." "Yeah," Elena said softly. "It gets into you, if you let it." "I want to let it," Daniel said, and though he was talking about the vineyard, something in his voice made it clear he meant more than that, and Elena, sitting beside him under the enormous star-scattered sky, found that she wanted the same thing, wanted it with a hunger that frightened her a little, because it meant her grief was making room, at last, for something else to grow beside it. She didn't kiss him that night. It was too soon, and they both knew it, and there was a kind of tenderness in the restraint itself, in choosing to let this build slowly instead of rushing toward it out of loneliness or convenience. But when he left for his B&B that night, he took her hand for a moment at the car door, just held it, warm and purple-stained and rough from the day's work, and said, "I'll come back next weekend, if that's all right." "It's more than all right," Elena said, and meant it more than she'd meant almost anything in 11 weeks. Word travels through wine country the way frost travels through a low block at dawn. Quietly and then all at once, settling into every corner before anyone quite notices it's arrived. By the second week of harvest, everyone from the tasting room staff to the distributor reps to the woman who ran the general store in town knew that Julian Ashworth's widow was spending her evenings with his half-brother from Los Angeles, and the valley, as valleys do, had opinions. Elena heard the first version of it from Consuela, who reported half apologetic, half amused, that a regular customer had asked, with barely concealed relish, whether it was true that Elena was marrying the brother for the money. She heard a rougher version from her sister-in-law, Julian's older sister Margaret, who called on a Thursday evening with a voice tight as wire. 11 weeks, Elena. He's been dead 11 weeks and you're already... Margaret stopped herself, but the accusation hung there anyway, ugly and unfinished. I'm already what, Margaret? Trying to keep the winery your father built from collapsing into a legal deadlock? Trying to figure out how to survive a codicil I didn't write and didn't ask for. You could fight it. Harmon said there were other options. Harmon said there were other options that would take years and cost most of what's left, while the business stagnates and the crew loses their jobs one by one because we can't invest in anything. Is that what you want? For me to burn the place down out of principle? I want you to grieve my brother, Margaret said, and her voice cracked on the last word. And Elena understood, underneath the anger, that this was really about Margaret's own grief, dressed up as concern. The particular fury of a sister who couldn't bear to see the world moving forward when her brother could not. I am grieving him, Elena said, quieter now. Every single day. Getting to know Daniel doesn't erase that, Margaret. If anything, it's the only thing that's made this bearable, because he's the only other person alive who misses Julian in a way that isn't just about missing what Julian gave them. Margaret hung up without saying goodbye, and Elena sat with the phone in her hand for a long time afterward, feeling the particular loneliness of being right and unbelieved at the same time. Daniel got his own version of the pushback 2 days later, from an old colleague who'd heard the story secondhand and called to ask, with a laugh in his voice that made Daniel's jaw tighten, whether he'd landed himself a vineyard and a wife in one trip. Daniel hung up on him mid-sentence, something he had never done to anyone in his professional life, and sat in his empty apartment feeling a rage he didn't fully understand until he examined it and realized. It wasn't about the insult to himself. It was the insult to Elena, reduced in one careless sentence to a prize, a transaction, when Daniel had begun to understand, across the slow accumulation of their weekends together, that she was the least transactional person he had ever met. A woman who gave away her grief like an offering, who had built an entire second self out of dirt and patience and stubborn faith in unlikely things. He drove up that weekend anyway, and found Elena in the barrel room, checking the reserve blend, her face drawn in a way that told him the week had been harder on her than her texts had let on. "People are talking," she said, before he'd even set down his bag. "I know. Let them. It's not that simple for me, Daniel. This is my community. I have to see these people at the farmer's market and the harvest board meetings for the rest of my life." Margaret called me. Her voice caught, and she pressed the back of her hand briefly against her mouth. She said I wasn't grieving him right. Like there's a right way. Like 11 weeks is a deadline I'm supposed to hit before I'm allowed to feel anything else. Daniel crossed the barrel room and, for the first time since they'd met, closed the distance between them without hesitation, without asking permission first. Not to kiss her, not yet, but to simply stand close enough that she could lean into him if she needed to, which she did, her forehead dropping briefly to his shoulder, her breath uneven. "There's no right way," he said quietly into her hair. "I've spent 2 years watching people decide how I'm supposed to grieve a father I never had and a mother who raised me alone and never complained once. Everyone has an opinion about someone else's grief. It's the cheapest opinion in the world to have, because it costs the person having it nothing at all." "What if they're a little bit right, though?" Elena whispered. "What if this is too fast? What if I'm using you to not feel alone, and calling it something else?" Daniel pulled back enough to look at her, his hands coming up to frame her face, gentle and uncertain. "Is that what this feels like to you? Using me?" "No," Elena said, and the honesty of it seemed to surprise her as much as him. "No, it doesn't feel like that at all. It feels like the first true thing I've had since he died. And that terrifies me more than the gossip does." They didn't decide anything that night, in the barrel room, with the whole valley humming its disapproval outside the walls. But 2 weeks later, on a night when the last of the Cabernet had finally come in and the crush pad crew had gone home exhausted and satisfied, Elena and Daniel walked up to the ridge above the property in the last blue hour of dusk, the way they had that first week, and stood looking down at the vineyard spread gold and dark beneath a sky just beginning to prick with stars. "I keep thinking about something Julian wrote me," Daniel said, "in one of the last letters before he got sick. He said the vineyard taught him that the things worth keeping are almost never the ones that come easy. That the Pinot Blanc only turned out extraordinary because he refused to believe the easy answer, that the soil was wrong, that it couldn't work here. He said good things take stubbornness and time and a willingness to be wrong about your fears." "He was talking about grapes," Elena said, though her voice had gone soft, unsteady. "I don't think he was only talking about grapes." Elena turned to look at him, the last light catching the sharp line of his jaw, the same jaw she'd flinched at the first day. Julian's jaw on an entirely different man, a man who had become, over these slow weeks, entirely his own person to her. Not a substitute, not an echo, but Daniel, specifically and only Daniel, with his careful questions and his hunger for a family he'd never had and his hands that had learned, in one October, how to cut a cluster of Pinot without bruising it. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not of you, of how much I want this. 11 weeks ago I buried my husband. Some part of me thinks I'm not allowed to feel what I'm feeling right now. I think," Daniel said, reaching for her hand in the darkening air. That grief and this, whatever this is, aren't actually in competition. I think you can miss him with your whole chest and still reach for something alive standing right in front of you. I don't think that's a betrayal of him. I think, from everything you've told me about who he was, he'd be furious with either of us if we let his death turn into a life sentence for you. That's convenient, Elena said with a wet laugh. Since he's the one who wrote the clause that put us here in the first place. Maybe he knew exactly what he was doing, Daniel said softly. Maybe he didn't want you alone. Maybe he looked at his own brother, a man drowning quietly in his own emptiness, and thought, there's someone who could actually see her, who could actually understand what she's carrying, because he'd be carrying a version of it too. Elena looked up at him, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 11 weeks finally, gently, let go. She reached up and touched his face, tentative, and Daniel went still under her hand like he was afraid to breathe wrong and break the moment. Kiss me, she said. If you want to, I want you to. I'm not asking you to fix anything. I just want to feel something that isn't only grief, for 1 minute. He kissed her carefully, like he understood exactly how much was being entrusted to him in that single unhurried motion. Not the desperate kiss of two lonely people filling a void, but something slower, more deliberate, an acknowledgement of everything that had brought them to this ridge, this dusk, this unlikely, stubborn thing growing between two people who had never asked to need each other and had come to need each other anyway. When they broke apart, Elena was crying, quietly, and Daniel wiped the tears from her cheek with his thumb, unbothered, unhurried. Okay? He asked. Okay, she said. More than okay. The months that followed were not a fairy tale, and neither of them pretended they were. There were nights Elena woke reaching for Julian out of 11 years of habit before remembering, all over again, that he was gone, and Daniel learned to hold that grief alongside her without trying to talk her out of it. There were days Daniel's old insecurities surfaced, the fear that he would always be, to the valley, to Margaret, to the ghost of Warren Ashworth himself, the illegitimate son who'd shown up for the money, and Elena learned to meet that fear with patient, repeated proof rather than empty reassurance, teaching him the business not as an owner claiming territory but as a partner building competence, block by block, harvest by harvest. They fought twice badly, once about whether to replant a struggling section of Merlot, a decision that surfaced every unspoken anxiety either of them had about who really had the final say, and once, more painfully, about a comment Daniel made, exhausted and unthinking, that landed too close to "you're only doing this because of the trust," a wound that took a full week and a long, difficult conversation on the stone wall outside the crush pad to fully heal. But they came back to each other each time older, steadier, having learned something true about how to fight fair with a person you intend to keep. By spring, Margaret had softened. Not all at once, but slowly, worn down by watching Daniel show up week after week, not as an opportunist but as a man who genuinely wanted to understand the brother he'd lost by tending the land that brother had loved. She came to the property one afternoon in April, unannounced, and found Daniel in the Pinot block with pruning shears, careful and slow, exactly the way Elena had taught him, and something in her face changed when she watched him work. "You're doing it wrong," Margaret said, coming to stand beside him. "You're leaving too many buds." "Show me," Daniel said without defensiveness, and Margaret did, and it was the beginning, awkward and unspoken, of something like family. They married in October, exactly 1 year after Julian's death, in the Pinot block itself, under a canopy strung with small lights between the rows he had planted, the fruit already picked, the vines settling into their autumn gold. It was small, Ruiz and the crew, Margaret standing beside Elena with tears she no longer tried to hide, Harmon Pruitt looking, for once, entirely satisfied with a legal document. Elena wore ivory, simple, nothing elaborate, and carried a small bundle of dried Pinot canes instead of flowers, an idea Daniel had suggested and that had made her cry the first time he said it. Daniel wore dark gray, and when Elena walked toward him down the row, past the vines that held every story she'd ever told him, he did not think of Julian's jaw, or Warren's legal knot, or any of the strange machinery that had brought them to this place. He thought only that he had spent 39 years as a shape where a family should have been, and that the woman walking toward him had, without either of them quite noticing when it happened, filled it. "I didn't come here looking for this," Daniel said, when it was his turn to speak, his voice rough with feeling he no longer bothered to hide. I came here to see the dirt my brother loved. I found you instead grieving the same man in a different key, and somehow, impossibly, we built something real out of what neither of us chose. Julian used to say the wine business was full of people who did what the soil report told them, and not enough people who talked to the land. I think what he meant was, don't be afraid of the unlikely thing. Plant it anyway. Let it prove you right. Elena, when it was her turn, could only manage through tears. You are the least likely, most necessary thing that has ever happened to me. I loved my husband with everything I had. I did not think there would be room for anything else. There was room. There is so much room. Thank you for being stubborn enough to stay and find it with me. They exchanged rings as the sun dropped gold and low behind the western ridge, the same light that had caught them both that first evening at the edge of the Pinot Block, two strangers grieving the same man, not yet knowing what they would become to each other. Ruiz gave the toast, as he had at the harvest dinner a year before, and this time his voice did not catch on Julian's name so much as it lifted, warm and certain. To the vines nobody thought would work, and to the people who plant them anyway. Above the valley, the first stars came out, patient and bright, over 1,100 acres that had, after everything, after grief and legal knots and gossip and slow stubborn faith, finally, fully, come home to itself. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, leave us a comment. Also like, share and subscribe to our channel, and click on the notification bell to get notified whenever a new story is made.